Ever since the war broke out in Ukraine, analysts have gone completely crazy trying to predict what might happen once the conflict is over, if that day ever comes. And pay attention, because some have even predicted that the very disintegration of Russia as a unified country could be on the cards. Okay, many of these theories may be pure propaganda, extreme estimates, or given the circumstances, they may serve certain interests. But they are still curious, and certainly what matters most to us here on VisualPolitik is that many of their arguments, well, they are true. One of these theories has caught our attention because it poses a question that most of us might never have considered. To what extent could jihadism contribute to the disintegration of Russia? Boom. I'm sure you're wondering right now, Josh, what the hell does jihadism have to do with Russia? Are there really that many Muslims in the Russian Federation? Well, actually, yes, there are. Approximately 10% of the entire Russian population is Muslim, and it is predicted that this figure could exceed 20% by 2030. And call me crazy, but we are talking about a Muslim population that, in a few years, will be well over 25 million, which is twice the population of Moscow. So I would say that this is a relevant issue, wouldn't you? Not only that, but Islam is also a majority religion in several regions of Russia. Take a look at this map. As you can see, there are 7 Muslim majority territories in Russia, the 5 autonomous republics of the North Caucasus, as well as Tatarstan and Bashkortostan in the Volga-Ural region. And although there is no official religion as such in Russia, it is supposedly constituted as a secular state. When it comes down to it, religion cuts across the entire field of national politics. And if you don't want to just take my word for it, just ask Patriarch Kirill.
Orthodox church leader says Russian soldiers dying in Ukraine will be cleansed of sin.
In any case, throughout most of the country, Orthodox Christianity is the majority religion. Nearly 80% of Russians declare themselves as such. Although the truth is that when it comes down to it, there are very few who practice. Some data indicate that barely 4% regularly attend religious services. Then again, the influence of the Orthodox Church has grown in recent years, thanks precisely to Putin.
We are simply at the beginning of the spiritual rebirth of our people. Patriarch Kirill.
Be that as it may, in the 7 territories where Islam is in the majority, however, Sharia is even the order of the day, especially in the republics of the North Caucasus. Do you want an example? Well, let's just say that in Chechnya, you better not be seen getting too affectionate with someone of the same sex, because they will either beat you to death or send you directly to a concentration camp. Yes, that's the way they do things in this part of the world. In this territory, many mosques have dedicated themselves to radicalizing as many parishioners as possible in order to feed jihadism in Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and in all the Muslim regions of Russia in general. So, knowing all this, the question is, to what extent could jihadism become a real problem for Moscow? How has the movement of these groups in Russia been so far? To what extent are we talking about an imminent clash that may even fuel secessionist desires? In this video, we will answer all these questions, but first, let's take a look at some history.
The Caucasus Emirate.
I am sure we all more or less know the history of the Islamic State. For years, the media kept bombarding us with news of their advances in Syria and Iraq, but I'm sure that very few of you know that Russia had to face a jihadist movement similar to that of the Islamic State in its own territory. Yes, that's right. We're talking about the Caucasus Emirate. Okay, it's true that it wasn't as big and didn't have as much of an impact on Russia as the Islamic State in the Middle East, but it still proved to be a real headache for Putin. Keep in mind that if the Emirate had become a state, it would have been larger in territory and population than Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. But of course, the question is Islam so important in Russia that a few radicals would go so far as to create their own emirate? Well, the short answer is yes. And it's certainly more important than you might think. You see, Islam arrived in the territory of present-day Russia in the 7th century, spreading right across the Caucasus. Since then, whether in Dagestan, Ingushetia, or Chechnya, Islam began to gain strength until it became the majority religion of the entire region. Of course, it was not a straightforward process, but instead was accompanied by several campaigns of repression against the Muslim population of the Caucasus, and also against the Muslim Tatars of the Volga-Ural. From Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century to the Soviet Union, the Muslim faith was harshly repressed for long periods of time in what today comprises Mother Russia. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union, religious openness returned, and with it, the resurgence of this religion in Russia. Not only that, but Muslim institutions such as the Union of Muslims of Russia, and numerous madrasas, and Islamic universities such as the Islamic University of Dagestan began to be established. In fact, Islam is so important that it has even become legally recognized as one of the country's 4 traditional religions. And as I mentioned earlier, it is the faith chosen by 10% of the country's entire population. That is, some 15 million people. Bear in mind, we're talking about a relatively younger population with more children, which is why its influence continues to grow. And okay, it is true that just because there is a reasonably large Muslim population in a country does not mean that there have to be problems per se with radical factions. But while it may not always happen, it does seem to have been the case in Russia. In fact, the Caucasus Emirate is nothing more than the legacy of the clashes and the two bloody wars between Russia and Chechnya that were fought from the early 1990s and well into the 21st century. As many of you probably know, the tension between Russia and Chechnya has traditionally been very high. Back in Tsarist Russia, the Chechens took up arms against the Russians in an attempt to gain their independence. And during the Soviet era, Chechnya was united with Ingushetia to form a single republic. In fact, they got along so badly with Russia that they fought alongside the Nazis. And in the end, when the Soviet Union fell, Chechnya declared itself independent in 1991. But it was not until 1994 that Moscow reacted with full force. From then until 2002, military operations were maintained in Chechnya, officially putting an end to the conflict, although the insurgency still continued for a few more years. Be that as it may, this was a real boost for the then new Russian leader. Let's just say that with the troops already stationed in Chechnya showing their might, Putin began to breathe easy. Terrorist attacks by Chechen separatists began to stop under the watchful eye of the father of our old acquaintance, Ramzan Kadyrov. But what Putin did not know was that, although he closed the door on Chechen separatism, he automatically opened a wide window to jihadist terrorism. And that window led to the Chechen separatist leader, Dr. Umarov, declaring the Caucasus Emirate in 2007 and starting the jihad against Russia. But what exactly was the Caucasus Emirate? Well, it is basically the project of a new independent state, governed by Sharia, and occupying the entire North Caucasus. That is to say, not only the autonomous republics of the region, such as Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia, but all the territory from Dagestan to the Sea of Azov itself. And I'm sure many of you are thinking that Chechnya was the most important part of this new emirate, right? Well, wrong! Dagestan took the cake. The Chechen jihadists were not content to stay in Kadyrov's land, and so began to expand throughout the region. In fact, to give you an idea, the emir who succeeded Umarov was a Dagestani. Then, further proof that Dagestan ended up becoming the epicenter of jihadism in the region is that this was precisely the region with the most victims and casualties from jihadist terrorist attacks. Chechnya was, therefore, in second place. But who are the groups behind the Caucasus Emirate? What is their real influence in the region? What danger do they pose? Are all Muslims supporters of this line of action against Moscow? Well, let's take a look.
Sufism versus Salafism.
At VisualPolitik, we know perfectly well that explaining the differences between various branches within the same religion is no easy task. And of course, Islam is no exception. So in order to understand the problem of jihadism, it's necessary to know the main differences. So let's keep it simple. We have already talked about it on one occasion or another. Islam is fundamentally divided into two great families, the Sunnis and the Shiites. This division dates back to shortly after Muhammad's death in 632 AD. Since then, Muslims were divided between those who believed that the caliphs should be the successors of the Prophet, starting with Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib. These were and are the Shiites, who, due to the hereditary character of their leadership, maintain a hierarchy led by ayatollahs, much more centralized and influential. On the other hand, there were Muslims who did not believe that Muhammad had left direct religious descendants, and that, therefore, the spiritual leaders had to be chosen by the community. These were the Sunnis, whose organization is based largely on decentralization. Well, as in almost everywhere else in the world, in Russia, the Sunnis are also in the majority. But pay attention, because within Sunnism, there is also other divisions, and the one that interests us the most is the one that exists in the North Caucasus between the Sufists and the Salafists. And I know what you're thinking. If they're from the same Muslim branch, they won't have many differences, right? Well, nothing could be further from the truth. You could say that, in general, Sufism is a minority branch in the Muslim world. Its emphasis, unlike the Sunni majority, is not on the purity of religious rites, but above all on the spiritual life. In other words, they seek a more mystical relationship with Allah on a very individual level, always respecting, naturally, the basic pillars of Islam. Salafism, on the other hand, is much more fundamentalist.
Traditionalist Salafism, in addition to purity of doctrine, concentrates on preaching with a view to strengthening the faith, preserving the cohesion of the community, and defending the Islamic moral order, a discourse that coincides with a break with the more lukewarm Muslims. Federico Anzar Fernandez Montesinos, 2014.
They do not differ only in terms of their more or less individualistic or collectivist vision. For example, the Salafists reject innovation in Islam because they consider it a deviation from the path marked out by Allah. Their aim is to restore the original practice of Islam by rejecting the influence of local culture and traditions. Sufis, on the other hand, tolerate and promote some innovation. They even have their own saints, something the Salafists totally reject. But the most important difference remains their positions on jihad, with the Salafists advocating it to a large extent, while the Sufis are much more moderate. As you can see, we can by no means say that Sufism and Salafism are twins. Therefore, it's not surprising that, wherever the two cross paths at the same time, tension and conflict between the two factions tend to arise. This is precisely the case in the North Caucasus. Sufism is well established here and is the branch of Islam that logically has Moscow's support. However, despite this, the reality is that Salafism has gained strength since the wars in Chechnya, and according to some estimates, as many as 700,000 Muslims may have adopted it in Russia. Be that as it may, today's Salafism began its global expansion in the 1970s, thanks in large part to money from Saudi Arabia, which was dedicated to building Salafist mosques all over the world. And of course, not surprisingly, many of these mosques not only performed the basic innocent services, but also served as centers of radicalization. And as we can all imagine, the worse the circumstances are in a place, the easier it is to radicalize faith. That is why Salafism has been so popular in the North Caucasus, because its autonomous republics have the worst economic data in Russia. To give you an idea, Ingushetia has the highest unemployment rate at 30%. Poverty in Karachay-Cherkessia reaches 25%. In fact, take a look at this table. As you can see, the 5 autonomous republics of the Russian Caucasus are among the 10 poorest regions in the entire country. Of course, this struggle between Sufism and Salafism is not unique to the Caucasus. We find something very similar in Africa. For example, in Ghana, between 2000 and 2010, Salafist NGOs in the country built 91 mosques and 89 schools. And across the African continent, the Kuwaiti Africa Muslims Agency has estimated that 6,000 mosques and 800 schools, or educational centers, have been built by Salafists in the last 35 years. Therefore, we are talking about a struggle between Sufism and Salafism of a global nature. In this case, in Russia, Moscow aligned itself with Sufism to stop jihadist Salafism. And to tell the truth, they've been quite successful, at least so far. Listen up.
The Russian antidote to Salafism.
As we've already seen, after the fall of the Soviet Union, religion once again became part of Russian society. Of course, not all religions have been treated equally. In fact, Orthodox Christianity has benefited greatly from this new tolerance of religion. While the rest of Europe was increasingly separating relations between state and religion, Russia has generously financed the Orthodox Church, given it privileges of all kinds, allowed it to teach its religion in schools, decisively influence laws, and of course, build as many churches as it wants. This is a clear point of tension with the country's Muslim community. Check it out.
Moscow's Muslims find no room in the mosque.
For example, while there are 600 public Orthodox churches in Moscow, there are only a handful of public mosques, with free access for the estimated 2 to 4 million Muslims in Moscow. Not surprisingly, with all these privileges, the breeding ground for radicalism is more than ripe. But Putin knows this, and that is why he has also sought to maintain good relations with Russian Muslims. Let's say that supporting institutionalized Islam, especially Sufi Islam in the Caucasus, is the way he hopes to fight against jihadist Salafism. Moscow supports Islam governed by 3 institutions: the Russian Council of Muftis, the Central Board of Muslim Clerics, and the Coordination Center of Muslims of the North Caucasus. If Muslim organizations in the country and in the autonomous republics of the Caucasus want to receive public funding from these institutions, being Salafist will not help them. In addition, Moscow has also focused on spreading Sufi Islam education, both in schools and in centers for re-education of former jihadist fighters, which is especially important because of the appeal of Salafism to the younger generation. However, what has made the biggest dent in the Salafism of the Caucasus has been direct action, that is, military action. After passing a series of laws at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the new century on religious associations and the fight against terrorist activities, Moscow got down to work. Both with its military forces, which, at least until the beginning of the war in Ukraine, numbered some 80,000 soldiers deployed in the region, and also with the armies of Putin's strongmen, as is the case, for example, of Kadyrov himself. In this way, jihadism has been losing strength. In fact, Moscow's pressure and agreements with many local leaders led to the Caucasus population itself being engaged in the fight against jihadism. And if you don't believe me, just ask these Chechen women.
Cheating evil. Chechen women con ISIS by posing as wannabe terror brides.
Okay, it's not the most heroic action in the world, but what counts here is taking money from the jihadists. So kudos to them. And to tell the truth, the lack of money has also caused Russian jihadism to lose steam. Since the emergence of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, most of the global jihad money has gone there, and the Caucasus Emirate ran out of both money and fighters. So, as things stand, in the end, the Caucasus Emirate, the greatest exponent of jihadist Salafist aspirations in Russia, disappeared in 2016. But keep in mind that this does not mean that Salafism as such has disappeared. Indeed, it remains tremendously popular among Caucasian youth because it offers them a way out in territory where opportunities are conspicuous by their absence. And not only for Caucasians, in Tatarstan, another autonomous republic within Russia, in the Volga-Ural area, there were also jihadist groups. Some of them have starred in news stories like this one.
Russian Muslim leaders attacked in Tatarstan.
In general, Russia has so far managed to contain the wave of jihadist terrorism that plagued the country and the North Caucasus in previous years. That jihadist separatist project that was the Caucasus Emirate failed when faced with the iron fist of Putin and his faithful men. Thus, the theories that have emerged in the wake of the war in Ukraine about secessionist pressures from Islamic Russia may be exaggerated. However, wait a minute. If things in Russia continue to get worse, with sanctions impacting the economy and a steady stream of young people dying on the front lines, that could become the perfect tipping point for a return, not only of Salafism, but also of secessionist desires in Muslim Russia. And take note, because history tells us that it is not so easy to keep largely Islamic territories under the control of a state that is increasingly linked to another religion, in this case, Orthodox Christianity. So this, VisualPolitik viewers, is one of the weak points that Russia may have to face in the coming years or even decades. A poor, young population of more than 25 million Muslims, with a cultural and religious identity so different from Moscow's, could end up becoming a ticking time bomb. But having said that, now the questions are over to you. Do you think Russia's strategy to curb jihadism and Salafism could be replicated around the world? Is jihadism in Russia a sleeping giant that could wake up at any moment and unleash chaos in Mother Russia? Could it eventually lead to the rise of separatist movements in the near future? You can leave us your answers in the comments. As always, don't forget that here on VisualPolitik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel, hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, go ahead, like it. I'll see you in the next one. All the best, see you soon.